know that I regularly share the vision for VR MMO Church as a whole, like I just did. But lately, I've been taking a closer look at the vision of Final Fantasy XIV, specifically MMO Church in Final Fantasy XIV, so that I can share that and make that more clear with us as a community, and so that we can work together to build that out and make it so. As I've been working through that, one of the things that I want to foster in this vision is Bible engagement and figure out how to encourage discipleship and growth, because that is one of the goals of church community. And how does that happen in a fully digital community? So, obviously, one of the ways that we do that is that we take advantage of digital tools. So, and thanks again to Toru for suggesting this, I set up a church profile in the Bible app, and I will share that link. I've shared it in the Discord with y'all, but I'll share it in the Twitch for those watching on Twitch as well, and it will be in the show notes later for those watching on demand later. This is the event, and that there's a link to the church profile at the bottom, but the events are set up for our services so that you can read along in scripture and you have additional study notes and questions to think about as how it applies to you and your learning and your own growth. How can we live this out together? So check out that event when you get a chance if you haven't yet, and be sure to save that, because it'll be hard to find it unless you save it or save that URL. And in that link at the bottom, there's a link to the profile, and you can choose to make VRMMO Church your selected church within the Bible app, and you'll get like updates on everything that's going on. But that's one of the ways that we're doing this, and people have been enjoying those resources and those discussions offline. But we're trying something else new to build on top of that now, and so we're going to spend time going through a Bible app study plan together and go through that during the weeks between services, because our services are every other week. They're not every week. And then during the service, I'll give a brief summary of the topic and my learnings on that on stream during service, and then we'll continue to discuss that in Discord voice off stream once we're done with the service. And so the info for the plan that we went through this last couple of weeks is in that event information, and it was a study plan from Bible Project called God's Heart for Justice. And I also included the study notes provided by Bible Project to their study that they did on this, for that word study in that event. If you want to check that out, it's really good as well. But when we were going through the study, I noticed some very interesting correlations that I'd never noticed before. And I say that all the time because it's always happening. Whenever I'm studying for services here, this always happens. And we seem to have, what I've seen is that we seem to have a similar attitude and behavior towards justice as we do towards sin. So we each define justice differently. We define good and evil differently. We justify our own actions while calling out others as unjust. We overlook our own sins while judging others for theirs. We have redefined good and evil to our own benefit at the expense of other people, and we look down on them in order to elevate ourselves as righteous and good. And this is not God's heart for justice. It's not his heart for how we live or treat each other. So in the Bible, there are two modes of biblical justice. There's the one that my brain goes to first, and that is the retributive recompense type of justice, which is the punish-reward system that you would see in the court of law. And I don't know about anyone else, but that's where my brain goes first when I think justice. But then there's also restorative justice. And this is making sure that everyone is treated fairly, and that we're granting everyone their basic rights, and that when we see an unjust practice or a law, we're changing that. We're making change. And this includes special attention to vulnerable people groups. And in the Bible, it's mentioned as the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, the poor, and ensuring that those vulnerable people are not taken advantage of, and it's ensuring that they're not ignored. And so in today's culture, you would think of that. So this was their culture then. So we would add on to that in today's society, who are these vulnerable people groups, and how can we make sure that they're not ignored, and so forth. So the Bible and God wants us to treat each other with dignity and respect. Seek out these vulnerable and elevate them, and speak for those who can't speak for themselves. It's a very selfless way of living. And in the study, it shows this connection between justice and righteousness, which brings up the question, what might pursuing righteousness and restorative justice look like right now in your own life? And it seems to me, when I was thinking over this, that pursuing righteousness and restorative justice requires a great amount of humility. We have to constantly check ourselves and make sure that we don't get so caught up in the fight for justice that we lose sight of everything, and that we end up committing this very same offense that we're fighting so hard against. And you see this all the time. Victims will become perpetrators, abused will become abusers, oppressed will become oppressors, and those fighting for tolerance will become intolerant, and those fighting for freedom will take others' freedoms away. So there's a very fine line between seeking justice and tolerance and oppressing those that you're fighting against and treating them the exact same way that you're fighting against them treating you. It is a vicious circle, yeah. And we're all guilty of this in some form. So it takes a lot of self-examination and humility and true look in the mirror to make sure that we do not become an offender. And it's a radical way of life, but it's what God's called us to do. In Micah 6:8, it says, God has told you, O human, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? He wants us to love our neighbors as ourselves. He wants us to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with Him. And that requires a reset in how we view each other and ourselves. Because all humans are equal before God. Humans have been set apart as the image of God, and we are called to treat others as image bearers of God with dignity and respect. So what does it mean to be the image of God? Think of it kind of like being an ambassador or a representative. We have been given authority to rule with Him and on His behalf. And all of us are called to participate. It's not just a select group of elite people. It's everyone. All of us. And it does not look like what we would expect it to look like. It's not what our idea of kings and kingdoms is, and it's not our modern concept of world rulers. We have been commissioned to develop the world. And what that looks like is cultivating and growing and developing ourselves, our families, our communities, and our world. Using the creativity and the innovation that we've been gifted by Him for the betterment of others. But then at some point, selfishness and evil broke this and brought about havoc and injustice. So instead of joint rulership, we end up lording over others and oppressing them. And instead of creating things that build others up, we create things that destroy others. We put people into categories because that makes it easier to dehumanize them, thus stealing their true identity and their true role and their God-given status as joint rulers. And when anyone is not treated as the image of God, it is injustice. But then when we try to fix things, we try to set things right, we end up oppressing one group to free the other group. But the good news is, the gospel is, that Jesus came to set things right. And He taught us how to truly rule as humans. And again, it doesn't look like what we'd expect. He taught and lived out a different way and a new way of being human and a new way of acting justly. By putting others before Himself, by loving His enemies, by working for the betterment of others. And in his life and in his teachings, there's this theme of cultivation and creation and growth, turning what was meant for evil into something good. For example, turning spears into plows. Weapons that were meant for destruction are being turned into tools to cultivate life. In Isaiah 2:4, this was predicted that this would happen. The Lord will mediate between nations and will settle international disputes. They will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will no longer fight against nation, nor train for war anymore. So this is an upside down way of living. And Bible Project calls this Jesus's upside down kingdom, where the first will be last, the last will be first. You are to love your enemies, and to find your life, you lose it. And it's not what we would expect justice to look like. And in the beginning, we broke God's shalom, his perfect peace. But his response was not destruction. His response was Jesus. And Jesus cleans the slate of our past, and he took that sentence, which we would call retributive justice, on himself. And he purposely sought out the poor and the hurting. He didn't confront or attack the people. And this is something very important. Humans were not the enemy. He confronted the effects of sin and injustice. And he invites his followers to do the same. He invites us to stand up for the vulnerable, to advocate for those who are looked down on in society, and to be a voice for those who can't speak for themselves. And this is what it means to be an image bearer, working to restore what was lost and carrying the good news of that restoration to others. And if we are members of Jesus' upside down kingdom, the question comes up is, how should we relate, if we're a member of Jesus' kingdom, how should we relate to the world government systems? And 1 Peter 2 has a very good answer for this. He says that we are strangers and exiles in this world, and there will be inevitable tension. And when that happens, we are to fight back with honorable living, not with violence or retaliation or conquest. In 1 Peter 2:13 through 17, I'm reading the Message version. Make the master proud of you by being good citizens. Respect the authorities, whatever their level. They are God's emissaries for keeping order. It is God's will that by doing good, you might cure the ignorance of the fools who think you're a danger to society. Exercise your freedom by serving God, not by breaking the rules. Treat everyone you meet with dignity. Love your spiritual family. Revere God. Respect the government. Treat everyone you meet with dignity. So this tells us not to use our freedom as an excuse to do evil. We are to respect everyone and to respect the government, which is really hard sometimes, depending on your government. We are to revere God, respect our leaders, regardless of whether they're who we wanted in office or not, and pray for them. And a great example of this is in the Old Testament. And you can read this in the book of Daniel. Daniel and his friends were captives in Babylon. So Jerusalem and the temple had been plundered and burned. And Israel became exiles in other countries. And they were a minority surrounded by new cultures and new gods that were not their God. And some accepted integration, some fought back. The prophet Jeremiah told them something different. Don't do either of those two things. He said to settle in and to build your future. Seek the well-being of Babylon and to pray to the Lord on its behalf, neither compromising nor revolting. And Daniel and his friends lived that out. They worked for the enemy, and they took Jeremiah's advice. But at the same time, they set boundaries. They did draw the line on the commands that they obeyed. They would not serve the Babylonian king as God. even though the penalty of not doing that was death. They non-violently laid down their lives. This is the way of the exile. And we've been called to live this way. And during this exile, Daniel had a vision that prophesied multiple successors to Babylon. So in the Bible, it's important to note that Babylon is not only a historical, geographical location, it is also a symbol and a metaphor. So Babel and Babylon are actually the same. They're not the same geographic location, they're not the same geographic city, but those words are the same word in the original. And it's also a metaphor for any culture that is built around making yourselves as God. And Babylon became a symbol for humanity's corporate rebellion against God. And so Daniel and Israel continued to be exiles under various Babylons. But there was this prophesied dream and vision that Daniel had, was that God would send a ruler who would bring down Babylon and bring a true kingdom of peace, of true peace. And then Jesus arrives under one of these Babylons, which was Rome. And he lives the way of the exile. He says, don't mistake Caesar for God, because God deserves our life and our allegiance, but he did say to give to Caesar what is Caesar's. He taught us to love and bless our enemies, and he was also arrested for speaking out against the religious leaders, and he was executed by the religious leaders through political manipulation of Roman leaders, which is the ultimate injustice. But God planned this, and Jesus willingly gave his life for this. He took what was meant for evil and he turned it into something very good. The ultimate restorative justice. God raised him from the dead as the true king, and he promised to one day return, and he will one day return. But he's coming to establish his kingdom. He's not coming to destroy the world. And he's not coming to destroy us. He's coming to renew the world, and he will destroy evil and injustice. And while we wait, we are invited to resist the culture of Babylon and resist the draw of evil. And we're invited to create and bring shalom, peace, and to live the way of the exile. And again, shalom is not just the absence of conflict, it is peace with something better in its place, where we're actively working for the betterment of each other. And we're called to live this way, and this again is the way of the exile. And I mentioned this at the beginning again, that we've got that Bible app event. So if you want to dig deeper into this, the links to all the things are in that event. And I've shared it there in the Twitch chat if you want to check that out. And if you scroll down to the self-reflection section, I've posted some questions and there are some study resources in there. And there is an awesome podcast series that I've linked in there as well from Bible Project on the topic of justice that has there's multiple episodes, but if you have to just pick one to listen to, if you didn't have time to listen to anything else, listen to the Q&R one, which is at the end of that podcast series, with question and response, which is very good. They have some very good questions in there, because it seems that people, even though we hear the same words, we take away something very different depending on our definitions of these individual words. So they clarify some things in there that some people misinterpret to their own agendas, basically. So it's very good if you want to dig deeper into that podcast series. The links in that event. So the questions to think about are: is there something that surprised you? And if so, how? Is anything confusing about this scripture? And what point spoke to you the most, and how did it affect you? And how does this apply to us today? And what changes do you think that God would want you to personally make in attitude, words, or actions? And how can we as a community live this out together? And what would the world look like if we all lived this out? So I'm going to stop the stream, and then we're going to discuss this in Discord. So if you want to join us in the Discord voice, you can to discuss. And I invite anyone in here to stay to discuss. But for those that are going to be watching this later on on demand, I've included these links in the show notes for you if you want to check out all the things. So I'm going to pray us out, and then we'll just continue discussing off screen. So thank you again, Father, for all of the things that you've allowed us to learn over the past few weeks. Thank you for the freedom that we have to learn about your heart for justice and what does this truly look like in our lives. Please bless each and every one of these lives this week in our community. Help us to get out of this, help us to think on these things and not forget these things, but to continue to work to become more like what you're calling us to be, this loving, this upside down way of living, this way of the exile. Help us to grow and to live this out. I ask these things in Jesus' name, Amen.